continued down the narrow path between the corn rows, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. It was as if the cornfield itself was alive, closing in around me. The wind shifted, causing the corn to rustle in a way that didn't sound natural, like whispers or something moving just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I kept walking faster, my eyes darting between the tall stalks, constantly checking over my shoulder. Every few steps I thought I heard something moving behind me. Too deliberate, too close. It was a sound I couldn't explain, and it made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn back, but something pushed me forward, telling myself I was almost through. Suddenly I froze. There, at the edge of the path, stood a figure. It wasn't the wind, or an animal, or just my imagination. It was a person, but something was off. They were standing motionless, barely visible in the dimming light, their face hidden in the shadows of the corn. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the air thick with an oppressive silence. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. They were just there, like a part of the field itself, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, no clothes, no features, just a vague silhouette. My legs felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the ground. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Then slowly, the figure began to step forward. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as if drawn to me by some unseen force. Each step it took sounded like a thud in the silence, the soft crunch of dirt beneath its feet, unnaturally loud in the stillness. I backed up, my breath catching in my throat, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. They were locked in place, as if the earth itself was holding me there. The figure's presence felt suffocating, as though it was pulling the life out of the very air around us. I could hear the faint rustle of the corn stalks, but it wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something close. Too close. I dared not look away, but the longer I stared, the more I felt the growing pressure in my chest, like a cold, invisible hand wrapping around my heart. The figure stopped suddenly, as though it had sensed my every movement. For a long, tense moment, we stood in a still standoff, the air thick with something heavy, something that pressed down on me, suffocating and suffused with a strange energy. Then it moved again, but this time it was faster, far quicker than I expected. The faint rustling became a sharp, unsettling sound, like the crackling of dry leaves, and I realized that it was not walking anymore. It was running toward me, but there was no sound of footsteps. Only the disturbing, unnatural rustling of something shifting in the darkness. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. As it closed the distance between us, my instincts screamed to turn and flee, but my feet were rooted to the ground. Then in a heartbeat, it was right in front of me, so close I could feel the unnatural chill emanating from it. Its face was no longer hidden in the shadows. I finally saw it, or what should have been a face, a void, a featureless mask of blackness, hollow and deep. I could feel its gaze, though there were no eyes, just an emptiness that swallowed everything around it. My heart pounded in my chest, every muscle screaming to escape. But I was trapped in that unblinking, dark stare. I stumbled back, my body trembling, but the figure didn't follow. It simply stood there watching me, like it was waiting for something. The silence between us grew heavy, unbearable, pressing against my chest. Then, from somewhere deep within me, a faint memory flickered. Something from my childhood. A name. A warning. Don't go into the field. The words echoed in my mind, though they made no sense now, not in the context of this terrifying moment. But I knew, instinctively, that whatever stood before me wasn't just a person, or even something of this world. It was something older, something that had been here long before me. Long before the farm or the field. The rustling of the corn suddenly became louder, more chaotic, as if something was moving through it. A shadow in the distance, another figure, this one even darker, materialized among the stalks. It was tall, impossibly tall, and moved with a fluidity that seemed unnatural, almost like it was gliding through the air. The first figure didn't react, but I could feel the change in the air. It was as if the ground itself had shifted, the very space between us tightening. I turned my back on them and ran, not daring to look back, knowing somehow that the only way I could escape was to keep moving forward. But no matter how fast I ran, the field seemed endless, the rows of corn stretching farther, as if they were mocking my attempt to flee. My legs burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. The sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, echoed through the cornfield, growing closer with each passing second. It wasn't a human pace. It was measured, almost like a predator closing in on its prey. I forced myself to look ahead, focusing on the narrow path between the rows of corn, but the rustling around me seemed to grow louder, more intense, as if the very earth was shifting beneath me. I felt a cold chill run up my spine, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, hunted. The wind picked up, whipping the corn stalks around me, but it did nothing to drown out the heavy silence that hung in the air. Every instinct screamed at me to turn, to run faster, but something deep inside me told me that doing so would make it worse. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I saw a break in the rows, a clearing up ahead. I pushed myself harder, my legs threatening to give out, but my mind focused only on the escape. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I felt a sudden force, as if the air itself had thickened, pushing back against me. I stumbled, barely catching myself, and looked up. The clearing wasn't empty. In the center stood a figure, draped in tattered clothing, its back turned to me. I couldn't see its face, but the air around it felt wrong, heavy with an oppressive darkness that seemed to stretch out from its body like a shadow. My heart stopped. I had nowhere to go. The figure slowly turned toward me, its face still hidden, but I could feel its gaze. It wasn't just watching me, it was waiting. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, still as stone, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing against me. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the world around us had stopped. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. It was like I had entered a place outside of time, where everything was distorted, where fear itself had become tangible. For a moment, all I could hear was the deafening silence, broken only by the faintest rustling of corn in the distance. Then, it moved. The figure's head tilted ever so slightly, as if it were studying me, its face still hidden in shadow. I tried to make out its features, but all I could see was the outline of its form, unnaturally tall and thin. The air grew colder, and I felt an overwhelming urge to look away, but I couldn't. My body, my mind, all of it was locked in place, as if some unseen force was holding me there. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the figure began to walk toward me, its steps deliberate and slow. The crunch of the corn under its feet sounded impossibly loud in the stillness, and every step felt like it was echoing deep into my bones. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. I could only watch as it drew closer, the shadow that clung to its form spreading, consuming the light around us. The figure was getting closer now, each step deliberate, its presence becoming more suffocating. I could see the faint outline of its face, or rather the absence of one. A smooth, featureless surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. It was like staring into a void, an empty space where nothing existed but darkness. The air was thick, pressing down on me with a weight that made it harder to breathe. I could feel the sweat beating on my forehead, the hairs on my arms standing on end. My legs trembled, my body begging me to move. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from that void where its face should have been. I tried to force myself to scream, to shout, to do anything that might break the paralyzing fear that gripped me. But nothing came. The figure moved closer, its steps quiet, yet somehow thunderous in the silence. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the growing sense of dread. And then, as it stepped within arm's reach, it stopped. Time itself seemed to freeze. The air around us was charged, the world standing still in that brief, awful moment. The figure raised a hand, slow and deliberate as if reaching for me, and I knew deep down that this was the end. I snapped out of my paralysis just as its hand brushed against my cheek, ice cold and unnatural. With a rush of adrenaline, I bolted backward, stumbling over my own feet as I scrambled to get away. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart hammering in my chest as I sprinted through the darkness, my mind numb with fear. The figure didn't chase me. No, it stayed perfectly still, as though waiting for me to come to it. But I wasn't about to stop. I didn't dare look back, but the feeling of its presence, that unshakable awareness of being watched, lingered. I ran until my legs burned, not stopping until I had crossed the boundary of my property, the lights of the house now in sight. Only then did I dare glance behind me, but there was nothing, just the empty, dark field stretching out in all directions. Yet I knew deep down that it hadn't left. It was still there, lurking, waiting. The following days were a blur of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond my sight. It was as if the house itself had changed, the walls heavy with an oppressive energy that never seemed to let up. I spent every waking moment avoiding the window, terrified that the figure might reappear. But one night, just when I thought the terror might finally fade, I saw it again. It wasn't in the field this time. No, this time it was standing by the window, its face barely visible through the glass. Its eyes were hollow, black as coal, and though it couldn't be heard, I could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness. My blood ran cold as I realized, whatever it was, it had followed me home.